Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the IAE Awards 2020 online program. We're so pleased to welcome you to the first event in our series of online webinars designed to inspire, influence, and share environmental best practice. Today's event will be focused on everything you need to know about reducing carbon, including offsetting, carbon neutrality, and net zero. Throughout the webinar, you can ask questions via the Q&A tab, which will be answered later in the event. Recordings of all events throughout the week will be shared via e-newsletter and to all attendees on Friday. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the IAE Awards, and we decided to launch a full program of free online events for you and your team to join. The aim is to engage organizations with different environmental initiatives to inspire, influence, and share best practice. The program will culminate in the IAE Awards on 4 p.m. on International Clean Air Day, which is Thursday, the 8th of October. This has been an unsettling year for businesses, communities, and individuals. The health and sustainability of our environment has never been so critical. The climate crisis and loss of biodiversity has been further exacerbated by the economic, health, and social challenges created by COVID-19. The pandemic has markedly changed business practices for the long term. We believe changing working practices to incorporate environmental decisions into the very heart of our organizations is vital to build resilience and create strong, sustainable businesses. By running our events online, we're hoping to bring people together, share learnings, and be an example of how events can be run sustainably in the future too. If you'd like to attend any other events this week, there's still time to register your place online through the IAE website. So good morning, my name is David Knight and I'm the environmental consultant at Investors in the Environment. As well as being your compere and master of ceremony for this event, I will also first cover an introduction to your organization's carbon footprint and the importance of on-site reductions to minimize emissions. You can also hear from Forest Carbon co-founder and director, Stephen Pryor, a former secondary school headmaster in Zimbabwe who discovered a second vocation through his Durham University Business School MBA dissertation, a study of environmental economics and how carbon markets could work in the UK. His findings, presented in a side conference at the 2005 UN Climate Change Conference in Montreal, convinced him of the importance of woodlands in an effort to deal with climate change and environmental degradation, and of the potential for carbon-funded woodland creation in the UK. He believes that having a credible plan to reduce CO2 emissions is not only critical in tackling climate change, but is also central to a business's reputation. Offsetting should be a part of the picture. Not only does it allow businesses to reduce emissions, it also opens up the opportunity to support a range of sustainability projects that add to an organization's identity. We will also be announcing the winner of IAE's Special Award category, Best Carbon Reduction, towards the end of the event. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Ecotricity for supporting this category and making this event possible today. So what is a carbon footprint? Any activity that as a result of its action emits greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, whether directly or indirectly, forms part of your carbon footprint. Under the Kyoto Protocol, there are 7 recognized greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere through various activities or processes. And when calculating and reporting your footprint, these emissions are expressed as an equivalent to carbon emission. Therefore, the term carbon is used to summarize these greenhouse gases. Some of these are emitted naturally, such as carbon dioxide and methane, whereas all of these are emitted as a result of our activities, whether through industry, agriculture, service provision, and technology. As you move through the list, the gas equivalents become more serious. For example, hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, which are used in refrigeration, such as air conditioning, has a potency as a greenhouse gas that can vary between 3,000 to 13,000 times more than that of carbon dioxide, and it is entirely man-made. We have to therefore think about our activities and processes and put in place the necessary changes, whether that is a product choice or a process elimination, to reduce and, where possible, remove the emission source of these gases. Carbon is embedded in absolutely everything we do, every resource we use. According to Overshoot Day, over half of the ecological impact we have on this planet is through carbon. And by August this year, our demand for ecological resources and services had already exceeded what the planet could regenerate. The IPCC calculated a carbon budget, which is the total number of cumulative emissions we can emit into the atmosphere, allowing for natural sequestration through the planet's carbon cycle, before the rise in temperature is almost certain. To ensure we minimize global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees, we have to curb the amount of carbon emissions and work towards removing carbon wherever possible. If we continue as we are, based on current global annual emissions, we only have around 7 years before we have to make significant changes to assure within a 66% certainty the rise is no more than 1.5 degrees. Once we reach 2 degrees and higher, the impacts, their intensity and the frequency increase significantly. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Governments are now more than ever pushing policy to encourage drivers, such as net zero by 2050 and the SECA, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Programme. But what is really promising is how quickly corporations, businesses, and individuals like you joining us today are rising to the challenge and leading the way through action and change to make the much needed difference. The NHS has just become the first national health service to commit to become carbon net zero, backed with clear deliverables and milestones. Microsoft pledged to be carbon negative by 2030 and to be completely carbon zero by 2050 based on total emissions since inception. During COP25 in Madrid, September 2019, 177 corporate companies pledged to all set science-based targets and work towards achieving net zero by 2050. These companies combined represent the same total annual carbon emissions as France, and that's in addition to the United Nations convened Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is the group of 29 of the largest financial investors who have all pledged to transition their investment portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. While these pledges are fantastic, we must all make real change in order to curb the increased impacts climate change will have on this planet. But in order to do that, we have to understand our carbon footprint and understand how much we contribute to the carbon budget. Then we can put in place the necessary measures to reduce our impact and support the 1.5 degree target. Now, today's webinar is meant to be informative, not educational. We will support all IIE members, anybody who's looking to start the process and build their foundation, and also those who have a foundation and are looking for the next step. If any of you are interested in joining IIE, please visit our website for details of how to sign up. Okay, so where to start? So starting out, you need to consider what your organizational boundary is. So that's really the business activity and how much of that is an impact. So the boundary is an imaginary line that helps determine which company operations need to be included in your inventory. There's two approaches you can take, equity share approach and control approach. Now, for most SMEs, the control approach would be most appropriate. That is then split into operational control and financial control. So operations are included within your inventory based on whether you have financial control or operational control of the activity. Once you've set the organizational boundary, the next boundary to consider is the operational boundary. Now, this determines which emission sources within your activities to include and how you categorize them. And that categories we refer to as scopes. The slide provides examples of different emission sources that can make up a carbon inventory. And as you can see, there are a variety of sources which will differ based on business activity and even the structure of the business, which you will set under your organizational boundary. Now, the above example has been taken from the GHG protocol and shows you how the scopes are applied and what they relate to, providing information on the entire value chain with upstream activities, your activities, and downstream activities. These up and downstream refer to your supply chain. One of the main benefits of the classification of sources is to avoid double counting, particularly amongst the same units within groups or linked companies. It also provides more useful information to stakeholders and helps to manage risks, identify opportunities along the value chains. When setting your boundary, identify the emissions associated with your operations, classify whether those emissions are direct or indirect, and then categorize them into their respective scope. And then just to clarify, direct emissions are from sources owned or controlled by your company, and indirect emissions are as a consequence of your activities, but occur at sources owned or controlled by another company, such as delivery of materials. The boundaries help establish a consistent method of accounting for emissions from your organization's activities. So we talk about scopes. What are they and what do they include? So the first scope, scope 1, these are direct emissions from sources your company owns or controls, and they're generated under 4 main categories. The first one is generation of electricity, heat and steam. Stationary combustion is referred to as, and that would be things like heating from your boilers, so the gas that's used to provide the heat. Transportation of materials, products, waste, and employees, or mobile combustion. This will be an example of a company fleet. Physical or chemical processing, and then fugitive emissions, which are unintentional release of emissions, such as air conditioning leakage. Scope 2 is all indirect emissions from purchased energies. That could be electricity, heat, and steam. Now, scope 1 and 2 are mandatory and must be included within your reporting. Scope 3 then accounts for all other indirect emissions. So this could be things as transport and vehicles that you don't own or control, or energy consumed by a consumer from one of the products that you've created. Now, scope 3 is optional, although to build the entire picture of your impact, they should be included. The process of boundary setting is vital for most SMEs, using operational control to determine which activities to include and considering scope 1 and 2 to first set your foundation is recommended. As mentioned, we can provide support to all members in setting these boundaries, whether starting out and developing or looking at scope 3 emissions for those who are looking to take the next step. So, accuracy of measurements are important as it's harder to act or make decisions when data is inaccurate or misleading. However, where accuracy is not possible, estimates can be used, provided there is some degree of accuracy built in. When starting out, it's important to build on what you have and know and put in place action and monitoring measures to build on what you don't. Now, while scope 3 is currently optional, it's strongly recommended that all businesses start to put in place action that develops and builds that data. The quicker you can act, the sooner you could start to make all the needed changes. Your supply chain is a key element to understanding the full impact you have as an organization. Developing relationships and starting conversations now, or even putting in place policy that requires supply chain information, will help to start building the information you don't have or know. This is how you start to build influence across your value chain and to start making wider and more impactful change. So for those starting out, where to source some of your information. So most of these can be sourced through invoices, bills, expense claims, or directly from meters, but there are some which may be a bit harder to obtain. So fleet, that could be fleet that you own or grey fleet, so that's travel through staff vehicles. It's best tracked through litres purchased, but mileage can be used. Where you are tracking mileage, try as much as possible to get the make, model, and fuel type of the car, as that helps to make more accurate conversions. Now for S-gases and anesthetics. So anesthetics for anybody in healthcare or the veterinary services. Anesthetics is available through bottle or canister purchases. And for anybody who has refrigeration or air conditioning, F-gases. The F-gas is the refrigerant within the system, and as part of any servicing that's carried out, the service note will include the amount of refrigerant that has been recharged back into the system. That recharge is a measure of the loss of refrigerant or leakage. And if you are unsure, speak with your servicing company for more information. Now, waste is often an area that most SMEs will struggle with, and that's typically because you don't have sufficient volume for a waste contractor to solely pick up your waste alone, and therefore can't provide accurate weights. Now, as a scope 3, it is an option to consider it, but where you wish to calculate and include it, it's possible to estimate waste using volume and density factors. Otherwise, for those who are looking for a more accurate, it may be possible to weigh your own waste before disposal. However, weight is needed when converting into carbon emissions. So once you know your sources of emissions, including any significant sources, you need to then think about setting targets. Now, when starting out, the first thing to consider is what you ultimately want to achieve. Now, that can be carbon neutral, net zero. You then need to consider what you need to do in order to achieve that action, and that will form the basis of your action plans. Then consider the timeframes. So when will you actually be able to make certain reductions by? Targets should be broken down by each source and consider what actions can be implemented, whether now, and what needs to be implemented in the future. And also look to include what steps are required in between where appropriate. Run scenarios to understand if actions are successful, what will they achieve? Consider that your business case, and then what impact each action will offer. You also need to include both the cost and time inputs into that action. Based on that information, recalculate what the new emission will be based on the new output, and set your targets from those outcomes. I usually say to allow some flexibility by either slightly reducing your target or slightly increasing your target, depending on how cautious or ambitious you wish to be. Now, once you have an established carbon footprint system, setting science-based targets is the next step. Science-based targets provide a clear route for businesses to future-proof growth by identifying how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. These targets are a measure of the global carbon budget and how much of that budget your company makes up, including any excess based against global benchmarks. So wherever possible, go straight for the 1.5 degree target, as that ensures your business will work towards the best reduction possible. Now, this slide represents the pathways for SMEs. Larger companies or companies with significant emission sources, such as those in construction, will have slightly different pathways and targets. Either way, The key steps to consider are measure, build accurate measurement processes. Ensure your data is as accurate as you can get it. The business case, build your business case for your science-based targets by running scenarios, understanding what impact your actions will have. Set your targets based on those outcomes. Develop your roadmap or action plan. So actually develop what actions you're looking to implement. And then finally, align everything with net zero. Once you start to build a picture of your carbon footprint and gain knowledge of how and where business's activity has the most impact, consider what is avoidable and what is unavoidable. Now, an easy way to explain this is unavoidable carbon emissions are emissions that cannot be reduced or removed. Now, either because technology to support that action doesn't exist, or the process that emits the emissions cannot be changed. Avoidable emissions are emissions that can be reduced completely and removed at site level. It's important to note the distinction that unavoidable is not as a result of the financial restrictions to implement certain changes, as these should still be considered avoidable emissions, with future actions put in place to continuously review and work towards its implementation as soon as possible. Where your annual emissions could not be fully avoided, removal of these emissions through greenhouse gas removal programs should be considered, or at least offset until such time as they can be reduced or avoided. It is important that your actions support your targets and that you build a long-term plan which considers what annual actions you can do over time, always moving towards your more high-level goals. In developing your actions that builds towards your targets, one approach to consider is avoid, reduce, offset, and remove. So avoid. What actions can we introduce that avoid the emissions in the first place? That could be things like switching technology or changing processes. Reduce. So what actions can we introduce that reduce the emissions? Now that can be through behavioral change or improved equipment or different efficiencies. And then finally, offset and remove. So where we can't do either, what can we do to either offset or remove our equivalent greenhouse gas emissions? Now, as discussed, it is important to consider the long-term plan and what we need to do over time to achieve the ambition. You can't change everything overnight. So planning and making changes where possible and building towards making changes is vital. Following this approach systematically, asking the questions and making the improvements will help you walk towards these targets. And as I mentioned, there's certainly a lot to consider and take in, but that is where we can help you. We offer support to all our IE members in tackling the subject and help break it down into manageable steps and working towards making reductions. So thank you very much for your time. We've covered what a carbon footprint is and hopefully why it's important to know why you need to set your, understand your carbon footprint and what makes up your carbon inventory, and also the importance of reducing emissions at source wherever possible. I would like to hand over now to Stephen. He will look at the steps of offsetting and creating a credible plan to reducing your CO2 emissions.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks, David, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I'll just check and see whether I'm able to move the slide forward. So just a quick summary there of who we are and what sort of qualifies us to be talking to you guys today, I guess. We've been planting woodlands in the UK since 2006. You'll see a map there with the sort of geographical spread. Those woodlands are planted on behalf of businesses that want to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions from their operations. And obviously because we know that trees capture CO2. So that's a starting point there. They also do a lot of other good things as well, which I'll touch on later. We've also, along the way, we were innovators in the UK. We were the first people to really be doing this in any kind of scale, the woodland carbon option. We've also developed the UK's first ever peatland carbon projects, peatland restoration to avoid carbon emissions. And we also developed the projects you see there in Ireland, which were the first ones, the first woodland carbon projects in Ireland. Those were on behalf of Microsoft. Sorry, David, I don't seem to be able to get the slides to forward. So just some numbers there about what we've done so far. 185 projects. When I say we, I guess I should make that clear that that's partnership working. That is us working with the businesses that have wanted to mitigate their carbon footprints, and it's us working with landowner partners. David, it might be better if I get you to control the slides. if you can go back to the previous one. Thank you. Yeah, so working together with partners and landowners and businesses, we've planted 185 woodlands so far around the UK, totaling 9.5 million trees. I think what's interesting, you can see bottom left statistic there, the impact that voluntary carbon mitigation activity by businesses can have on woodland creation in the UK. We've accounted for 7% of all tree planting since 2014 across the country, which I think is a significant impact. Next slide, please. So there are two different types of carbon markets. The first one is compliance, and I'll just give you the background on how that works. As the name would suggest, participation is mandatory. Examples there would include the sort of country-to-country international emissions trading, which started up under the Kyoto Protocol, and also the business-to-business emissions trading, which occurs through the EU ETS and what is likely to replace it as we leave the EU. So that's all businesses which are compelled to participate in some sort of carbon trading scheme. The characteristics there are that it's a cap and trade based scheme, which I always sort of describe to people as musical chairs. The idea is that the number of credits in the system reduces each year, and businesses are running around chasing fewer and fewer credits, which theoretically will get more and more expensive. So it's better, therefore, to reduce your emissions than it is to be trying to buy the decreasing number of credits that will be available. Market prices there are based on the normal rules of supply and demand. Participants have deadlines, credits have expiry dates, so as people chase those credits, they become more expensive. And that's the likely source of carbon prices that you may see quoted along the way. So if we go forward there, David, yeah, so none of this really relates to I guess most people on this call, and in fact we're now looking at voluntary markets, which is where your area of interest would be. As the name would suggest, participation is voluntary. Carbon buyers are usually businesses, and they are paying somebody else to implement a project that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions or capture greenhouse gas emissions, one or the other. To date, the project costing there, the credit costing, has been project-based. Supply of those credits has historically significantly outstripped demand, so therefore the costing has been based, on a project-by-project cost basis rather than supply and demand economics. Project types there will typically include emissions avoidance, for example, renewable energy projects, and emissions capture, which is, for example, forestry projects. Thank you, David. So how the voluntary carbon market works, as we've touched on already, this is a voluntary thing in the UK. There are no rules forcing businesses to do this, so you're all here for voluntary purposes. First step, as David has touched on, reduce, avoid, and so on. Best practice, better to prevent than cure. Also, carbon, generally speaking, is embedded in some kind of a resource that you're consuming, so reducing emissions will tend to lead to cost savings as well. Eventually, at some point, it's going to be too expensive to continue to reduce those emissions further, or just plain impossible. As David alluded to, the technology just doesn't exist. In which case, that's where offsetting comes in. You can pay somebody else to reduce emissions on your behalf, and you can count those emissions reductions against your carbon footprint. We talked about this earlier. Carbon footprints are quantified in tons of CO2, and the way offsetting works is that a carbon credit equates to 1 ton of CO2, so that you can easily match your footprint against the credit project. So in the case of offsetting, a carbon credit equals either a ton of CO2 that somebody else has avoided emitting, or a ton of CO2 that somebody else has recaptured. Finally, their offset credits, they should be quality assured. Any offset project that doesn't have any kind of independent quality assurance is not going to be credible. First and foremost, you need to know that your money is going where you said it should, where it's supposed to go. So that's the final point. Recognized carbon standards include the VCS. Probably most of you will have heard of these. Gold standard, Plan Vivo. Those first three are typically for use in developing or least developed nations. They don't really apply in developed countries. Developed countries themselves have started recently developing domestic voluntary carbon standards. And in the UK, we have the Woodland Carbon Code, which was developed in 2011. And we've got a peatland code coming along in parallel quite soon. So how and why projects are quality assured? You want independent audit, obviously, from third parties, and those third parties themselves should be accredited to the relevant standard. You want to know that the carbon projections from the projects are conservative, scientifically sound, and they're project specific. They're not just based on general estimates. They are based on the specific project. Additionality is the most important one there. We feel, and I think probably most participants would feel, this is an examination of the financial and behavioral aspects of the project, and a demonstration that without the participation of the carbon market, without people investing in offsetting their carbon credits, this project could not have proceeded. So we do a lot of work on that with our woodland creation projects in the UK, proving that these are not business as usual projects. They could not go ahead without the addition of carbon funding. Permanence obviously is a big one. We want to know that these are permanent emissions reductions. In the case of the UK, we've got various contracts, rules, regulations, and laws which mean that creating a woodland is seen as a permanent land use change here. So that's the sort of permanence protection. Monitoring means we go back to projects, or whichever type of project it is, whichever standard is certifying it. The project needs to maintain certification. People need to go back and monitor it to ensure that it's still delivering the carbon savings that it said it would. Buffering is a kind of, again, a principle of conservatism, which is to say that all projects have a top slice removed, which goes into a sort of a pooled buffer, which acts as an insurance scheme across all the projects. So it gives you as carbon buyers, businesses, a very high degree of certainty that the carbon savings you are paying for are going to be delivered. Obviously, there are social, environmental, and legal requirements. That's very important. In the UK, there's the UK Forest Standard, which applies to woodland creation here as well. So high degree of sort of supervision there of those sorts of things. And I've already listed those leading carbon standards. The second element to quality assurance is a thing called a registry, which is where the carbon credits themselves are issued and where the ownership of those credits is demonstrated. It just provides for the sort of final transparency piece in the whole process. You can see which project the credit came from. You can see that it is certified, and you can see that the carbon credit is owned by the business whose account the credit is in. So you can see that businesses have made good on their claims. And there are several of those registries around the world. I should say at this stage as well, that there are two types of carbon credits, and this is particularly germane to projects which take a long time to deliver carbon savings, such as woodlands. An ex-ante credit is a credit issued at the beginning of a project's life. I always sort of talk about those as promissory notes, which is a promise of future carbon savings, and it represents ownership of those future carbon savings, or in the case of woodlands, carbon capture. And then there's ex-post credits or delivery notes, which represent ownership of emissions which have already occurred. So in the past, emissions which are in the bank. Thanks, David. Yeah, David's touched on some of this already, but these are the sort of claims you can make, and I think it's really important to understand the distinctions across these three different things, particularly when, and this is a problem really that's specific to us, in that we are planting new woodlands which have a long-term carbon delivery timeline, and if people come to us and saying, you know, they want to be carbon neutral, can they plant some trees? The answer is pretty much no, because carbon neutrality, as David has touched on, first of all, you need a high degree of certainty about the actual footprint itself. You then need to be using carbon credits, the ones I've described earlier as delivery notes, ex-post carbon credits, credits where the carbon saving or the carbon capture has already occurred. You know, obviously, in the case of new woodlands, that's not going to be true. The carbon capture is long into the future. So, carbon neutrality, high degree of accuracy, and you need ex-post credits. And I'll touch on the types of project that deliver those types of credits in the next slide. Net zero, again, we've touched on that so far. Really, the key principles there are that it acknowledges that there's a finite remaining carbon budget. So the distinction between net zero and carbon neutral is, with carbon neutral, you could continue with your emissions and get somebody else to avoid emissions on your behalf. With net zero, if you continue with your unavoidable emissions, you need to recapture those emissions. So that's based on things like woodland creation, carbon capture and storage, peatland restoration, projects which will recapture the greenhouse gas emissions that you have made. Net zero does align itself quite nicely with woodland creation as a carbon tool, because if you look at the UK's net zero deadline 2050, we're talking to a lot of businesses at the moment about if you estimate as readily as you can, and we realize that's going to be inaccurate, but look at what your emissions might be between now and 2050. Look at a 30-year horizon, and then we can talk about woodland creation program that will recapture those emissions over 30 years. So you can align net zero with woodland creation activity. And then the final sort of softer area, which is where most of our partners have worked historically, softer statements, you not talk about carbon neutral and net zero, don't talk about offsetting, just talk about mitigation, balancing, recognition, addressing your carbon footprint. CSR oriented statements must be clear about what's included and excluded, clear about what you are doing. And you can therefore also use ex-ante credits, the promissory notes, for that sort of activity. And the reason we've always persevered with this model is that I think in a lot of cases it will enable action. It doesn't make perfect the enemy of good. And what I mean by that in our context is that technically, if you planted a woodland today as a landowner, you wouldn't have a carbon credit to sell, an ex-post carbon credit for 15 years. And there aren't many people who have that kind of financial independence or wealth that they can do that. So we need to be generating carbon credits and getting investment into new woodlands as quickly and as much as possible. So that's where we operate. So typical offset projects, I touched on these earlier. Energy will be renewable energy projects, usually in China or India. They are extremely low cost and they produce instant carbon savings. Obviously, you'll understand that every time a turbine blade turns, some fossil fuel emissions are saved elsewhere. So that's the sort of the cheapest, most instant source of carbon neutrality would be projects like that. There are several challenges. These projects are truly additional, so you would have to do your homework reviewing each project specifically before you approach those. Second type is land use. That would be, in our case, forest creation, or also there's a avoided forest loss, forest protection, which doesn't apply in the UK because legally there should be no deforestation here, but typically that would be sort of tropical and subtropical areas. As far as land use change project go, UK, US, Australia, and New Zealand are the countries the world's leading countries when it comes to developing domestic carbon credit standards, which include forestry. From other parts of the world, typically Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, you will generate international forest carbon credits from those countries. In those developing countries, those least developed nations, the afforestation projects in those countries will typically be commercial timber or agroforestry programs. They won't be kind of native and biodiversity oriented projects. They will have an element of that in them, but they will need to be some sort of commercial or agroforestry operation, simply because people need incomes. These projects need to stack up locally, economically. And there's a range of prices of that type of project in a range of locations. And then the final sort of category of project I always refer to it as aid-based, which is things like water access, clean water, clean cook stoves, clean transport, mostly in developing countries, and usually these are the most expensive types of carbon credits. Thanks, David. So coming back to what forestry in the UK, this is our kind of core expertise. There's a lot of information there, but obviously I think we all instinctively know trees are a good thing and woodlands are a good thing. There's sort of 8 areas there that are of particular interest. I think flood mitigation is important as we have to adapt our landscape to a new climate. And we know that the next 30 years worth of climate change are already sort of hardwired into the climate. We're going to have to adapt the landscape. We all kind of know instinctively that we're seeing more flooding in the UK, and trees, woodlands in the right place upstream are a very cost-effective way of mitigating downstream flooding. And we've done a lot of projects in the last few years that have flood mitigation as one of their core objectives. Also, I think at the other end, we've got sustainable timber projects. We do some of those, and sustainable construction. 45% of global emissions come from buildings, and that includes the materials that go into buildings. And globally, only 33% of timber consumption is from sustainable sources. So it really stands to reason that the more sustainable timber we can grow in the UK, the better the economic impact here, but also the less the impact on old growth forests at the other end of that supply chain if we're growing more sustainable timber in the UK. So lots of good news stories there with woodland creation. Thanks, David. Quality assurance, I've touched on that in a general sense. In a specific way, here in the UK, we have the Woodland Carbon Code, which was developed by the UK government, by the Forestry Commission for the government. It was launched in 2011. It is independently accredited audit under ISO certification, ISO 14065 for those of you in the know. The standard is a quality assurance standard first and foremost, so it's ensuring right tree, right place, right reason, proper management, long-term protection. Also covers those other things I touched on earlier, conservative carbon estimates based on project-specific data, covers additionality, permanence monitoring, all those sorts of things. It really is one of the world's leading domestic carbon standards, and I think at the time when it was launched, 2011, it was a really innovative piece of policy making by the Forestry Commission. The carbon credits from the Woodland Carbon Code are listed on the IHS Market Registry. IHS Market, big financial data services company, is one of the world's leading credit registries, provides all the sort of transparency I touched on earlier. Thanks, David. Thought I'd just chuck in a quick case study here, just so you can sort of see the kind of work we do in practice. We've been working with the Tweed Forum since 2012. They're sort of an umbrella, charitable umbrella organization representing farmers, landowners, local authorities, businesses in the Tweed catchment, cross-border, Northumberland and the borders. We've planted 16 woodlands with them since 2012, about 450,000 trees, about 82,000 tons of CO2 will be captured by those woodlands. They were all specifically designed to prevent downstream flooding in the Tweed catchment. So they provide a load of other benefits too, biodiversity, for example, also improved water quality, improved riparian biodiversity. All these projects are planted on private land, all co-funded with carbon funding secured from those businesses whose logos you see there. I think what's interesting about that is that none of those businesses has an office or an HQ anywhere near the borders or the Tweed catchment, but they really believe in the value of contributing to projects wherever they are in the UK. Thanks, David. So final note here, I think, was just to sort of, I guess, again, you'll be familiar with most of this stuff. You're in the right place if you're here listening to webinars like this one, because the direction of travel is clear in UK government policy and wider. We've got Climate Change Act, net zero commitments, clean growth strategy, SECR, Paris Agreement replacing Kyoto. We've got the International Civil Aviation Organization CORSIA scheme, although in fact they're probably net zero now anyway, nothing to do with any of their schemes. The UK itself is second only to the US in terms of the total voluntary carbon market spend by businesses, and it's home to Europe's largest sustainable and responsible investment market. So it's just a real clear indication there of the direction of travel, and you're in the right place at the right time. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks for everyone as well. Just want to go through a bit of a Q&A. So thank you to those who submitted questions. Just going to start from the beginning. I think this would be a question for you, Steve. So the questions come in, what is forest carbon's biggest challenge in the coming years?
I think at the moment the challenge has been, I think probably this would probably hold true for most businesses in the country. The challenge has been Brexit uncertainty, and I don't mean that in terms of, in our case, it's not so much in terms of the economy, it's to do with government agricultural policy post leaving the common agricultural policy. So we're still involved in redesigning the sort of agricultural subsidy regime that will apply over the coming decades. And that's made landowners and farmers a bit hesitant about committing to land use change in the form of woodland creation when they're not sure what the regime is going to be in the future. So that's sort of been the biggest challenge. We are seeing some loosening up at the moment as people get a better idea of what the replacement regime will look like.
Brilliant. So one of the other questions here, I think is one I could probably answer. So someone's put in, we're a small business and might struggle to calculate our scope 3 this year, but we at least want to get started. Would including scope 1 and 2 be acceptable? So I think if I'll start, and maybe you could finish off, Steve. So in terms of carbon calculation, yeah, that's absolutely fine. The mandatory, as you mentioned, the mandatory reporting is scope 1 and 2. And that really helps you build the foundation in terms of what your immediate impacts are. It's best to start that process first, get a handle with what it is that you are emitting directly or through the purchase of electricity, and start to really understand where you can make your changes and reductions in-house first. Once you have that understanding and that development, that's really the opportunity to start looking at your wider scope 3. You know, we talked about doing that as soon as possible, because the sooner you can understand scope 3, the better. But it's always best to make sure that you're comfortable with your foundation first before you start to look at that, because scope 3 emissions are a little bit harder and a bit trickier to actually to obtain, first of all, because it relies on other people's data, and two, to calculate, because as I say, you are relying on data that may be slightly more difficult to verify. I don't know if you had anything else to say on that, Steve? No? Okay, that's fine. Brilliant. Okay, so how do we encourage businesses to reduce before they offset? Is that something you do with the Steve, in terms of encouraging people to reduce their carbon before they look at offsetting?
Yeah, we do. I've got two answers to that question. The first one is, I think I touched on in the presentation, which is, you know, emissions represent resource consumption. So that's the primary motivation I can think of for people. If you can reduce mileage, energy, and so on and so forth, all your bills are going to go down. So seems like a no-brainer to me. We do encourage people hard to reduce before they offset, but we don't exclude them, because we also recognize we work with lots and lots of businesses that, you know, for every Marks and Spencers in the world that's got a really well-resourced sustainability department and a cast iron, copper-bottomed sustainability plan, there are businesses that just don't have that resource in-house, and will struggle to come up with all the work that needs doing before they begin to talk to us. So we, as I touched on in the presentation, we don't want to make perfect the enemy of good. If people want to support offset projects in the form of woodland creation as part of their journey towards also beginning to figure out how to reduce, then we're not going to turn them away unless they reduce before we talk to them.
Yeah, brilliant. And I would sort of mirror that same content. I mean, the in terms of encouragement is I say that the first step to reducing your carbon emissions means reducing the source of that. So that would be either the energy you're using to do that. So by actually reducing that, you're saving money off your own bottom line. So it's from a business point of view, the first saving is the actual cost saving, and then the carbon sort of comes with that as well. Brilliant. Okay, so another question that's come in. So an interesting one. So which is the best carbon calculator? Can we use any online calculators? And is there anything that we should watch out for if we do? I mean, look, it's a very interesting question. The best carbon calculator is the one that's most accurate. So yes, you can use online calculators, but I guess what you need to look out for, and the second part of the question is just who's created that calculator. And if you are going to use an online calculator, what I would suggest doing is actually contacting the company that's created it and ask them for their methodology. So ask them for where they got their conversion factors from and the methodology they've used for the conversion. That's really the most important. I mean, you know, in terms of understanding your carbon footprint, as I mentioned, the measurements need to be accurate, but so do the conversions. If best, to possibly try and do it yourself if you can. However, if it's not possible to do yourself, online calculators are there. But again, just speak to them first so you understand how they've done it and make sure that you're happy with what they've put forward as their methodology. So another one for you, Steve. Would you be able to say a bit more about the peatland restoration carbon project you're delivering?
Sure, yeah.
This is kind of a two-part question, sorry. Will this become a big market once the England peat strategy is published in the near future?
Yeah, sure thing. In fact, I'll just go back to that carbon calculator thing as well. I mean, we always just send people, you know, the government greenhouse gas conversion data tables are freely available in the public domain. So we always send people a link to those and then you can create your own carbon calculator based on the kind of government's published data. Peatland restoration projects. Yeah, we've got we've got a peatland code under development, which will mirror the Woodland carbon code in terms of it's currently going through its sort of accreditation process so that it's a fully ISO accredited standard. We hope that will take about another probably year or so, I guess. Once that's done, it will again be, as with the Woodland carbon code, it will be issuing carbon credits on the IHS market registry. So it will complete that kind of quality assurance and transparency work. We completed the first peatland carbon restoration project in the borders in 2017 and took that through the peatland code in its kind of pre-accreditation stage of the code. We took that through the peatland code in 2018 and it became the first peatland code accredited project. We've got 2 others in the pipeline at the moment, also in the borders. And we've got conversations as well underway with a couple of AOMBs in England as well to do some projects. So there's definitely movement there. I think it's exciting. It's got the scope to deliver significant numbers of tons of CO2 reduction compared to woodland creation. It also has the advantage of being an emissions avoidance activity, whereas woodland creation is an emissions capture activity. So it can deliver carbon savings more quickly because an avoided emission will occur, immediately once you restore peatland.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So I'm just conscious of time. Unfortunately, we've sort of run to Q2, which is ideally when we'd hoped this program would end. So I do apologise we've run a bit of time. What I'll do is we have a few more questions on there, but I'll probably look to answer just one more, and then we'll move on to the actual awards themselves. So for anybody who has put questions through, thank you very much. If we've been able to answer them on this webinar, we will ensure that we get back to you afterwards as well, and at least answer those questions. But just the last question that's come up. So it's an interesting question, is where do you draw the line for carbon calculations, in particular in construction? For example, is it just on the materials used and the lifespan of the building, or would you include workers commuting to the site, etc.? So when we talked about the operational boundaries, and that's where you look at the emission sources and you start to look at your category and your whether they're directly or indirectly, and then you look at categorizing them in scope 1, 2, and 3. The line drawn is where you kind of need to. So you first look at your organizational boundaries, so look at all the operations that are within your control, whether that's financial or operational control. You would then look at the emission sources, or what is directly as a result of you directly doing it and what is indirect. And then you would determine what is scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And then what you include in that will depend on your ambition. So as I said, mandatory would be scope 1 and 2. So that would really be looking at emissions that are direct results of your activities. So for example, in the construction industry, that would be the materials you've used. As a scope 3, you would look at the lifespan of the building and the workers commuting. So how the building will be used, unless you're actually using the building yourself, you can't really conclude that as a direct emission. But yes, the use of that building and the energy that building actually generates in terms of emissions would be the life, and that would be the downstream part of the value chain. So you would look to include that as a scope 3 reporting. Workers commuting to site, again, if it's in their own vehicles, that would be a scope 3. Now, initially we would say, look, concentrate on developing scope 1 and 2, get that in place, and then look at your scope 3. So for businesses who are now looking to take that next step, yes, you would need to start looking at the lifespan of your building, and also would look at the sort of, shall we say, the travel arrangements of your workers. And then where you could look to make improvements would be the type of buildings that you create, in terms of looking at low carbon passive housing, that sort of thing. And then in terms of worker commuting, that's where you'd have sustainable travel plans put in place to help them encourage to car share or take public transport, or even use active travel such as bikes or things like that as well. So the line for carbon calculations is really where you want to draw it as a mandatory scope 1 and 2, and then everything else is where we suggest businesses start to look at that next step, is that scope 3. As I said, we've had a few more questions, and they're really good questions, but unfortunately due to time, we are going to have to move on. For those who've submitted questions, thank you very much. By all means, we will get back to you and answer those after the event as well. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. So this year we're marking a decade of the IAE Awards. Now, in addition to bronze, silver, and green accreditation, we're also awarding IAE member organizations for going above and beyond in 8 special categories. Now, the results of these will be announced throughout the week and at the IAE Awards itself on Thursday. But today, we're ready to celebrate the winner of our Best Carbon Reduction category for 2020. So we were looking for a reduction in absolute carbon relative to other IE members or averages for their sector, along with significant progress towards halving their carbon emissions since their baseline year, and in alignment with national net zero emissions. So based on that, I'm very happy to announce the winner for this year's Best Reduction Carbon 2020 is Northumbria Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust. Now, the judges were impressed with the organisational approach the Trust has taken, with strong policy supported throughout the Trust and high levels of staff engagement and interaction. The Trust achieved an annual reduction of 6,440 tonnes of CO2 based on energy waste and travel, which was a 70% reduction from the previous year. The Trust has also achieved a 32% reduction from their baseline, which includes 45% reduction in their energy consumption. And the judges were really impressed with the Trust's approach to sustainable travel, reducing travel by 15%, and all of that despite an ever-increasing patient footfall. Now, finally, before we end, the judges just wanted to mention how pleased they were with the entries received for this category and the efforts that our members have gone to in tackling carbon reduction. The scores were very close across all submissions, and it was really difficult to select a winner. However, as such, the judges would like to commend Northampton General Hospital NHS Trust for their amazing work in reducing anaesthetic gas emissions by a carbon equivalent of 338 tonnes through strong levels of engagement and working closely with the department to change behaviours. So, I would first like to thank all IAE members for the tremendous work they have done over the last year. I would also like to thank our category sponsor, Ecotricity, and thank you to all our other IAE Awards 2020 supporters, who are Cross Schemes Homes, Babies the Veterinary Specialist, BGL Group, Hunt & Coombs, Green Energy Switch, Cool Food, and Roy Thorne Solicitors. Thanks again to Stephen, who's our guest speaker for today, and thank you very much to all of you who could join us today. Please join us for the rest of our award presentations and webinars throughout the rest of this week. The next one is Best Water Reduction Award, and the webinar with speakers Andy Brown from Anglian Water and Kate Marks from Waterwise, which is this afternoon at 4 p.m. We really look forward to seeing you all there. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have a great Monday and a fantastic week. Please take care and stay safe.
Cheers, everybody.